After his wife's funeral, the son-in-law threw his mother-in-law out on the street. But when the time came for him to inherit, a surprise was waiting for him. The sound of the gavel echoed in the courtroom, finalizing the life Elizabeth once tried to hold together. Her husband Jack stood emotionless, his tailored suit sharp against the backdrop of grief. Next to him sat Helen, Elizabeth's aging mother, her face lined with anguish yet steadfast with quiet resolve. Elizabeth's funeral was a somber affair, but for Jack it was merely a prelude to his true goal, securing her assets. Weeks after the ceremony, Jack's impatience grew intolerable. "This apartment," he spat one day, standing in the doorway of the living room, "it's too big for you, Helen. You should move somewhere more manageable." Helen didn't flinch. "This was Elizabeth's home. I cared for her here, and I have no intention of leaving." "You can't afford the upkeep, and frankly, you don't need all this space," Jack retorted, feigning concern. "It's not about space. It's about memories," Helen replied softly, her eyes briefly wandering to the framed photo of Elizabeth on the mantel. Jack's jaw tightened. He knew the will left the apartment to Helen, but he was determined to find a loophole. The law might protect her, but Jack wasn't one to play fair. Late one night, Helen overheard Jack on the phone. "I don't care what it takes. She'll be out, and I'll get what's mine," he hissed. Helen's heart sank, but she remained silent, knowing she would need more than sentiment to stand against him. Helen Thompson's days were filled with quiet routines, but the silence weighed heavily on her. The spacious apartment once resonated with her daughter Elizabeth's vibrant energy. Now it was a solemn monument to the life they had shared. Every room told a story, photographs on the walls, Elizabeth's favorite books neatly arranged, and a dusty piano sitting by the window, where she once played lullabies on sleepless nights. Helen had faced life's challenges with quiet strength. A widow for years, she had raised Elizabeth alone, instilling in her fierce independence and unyielding compassion. Now, with Elizabeth gone, Helen leaned on those same values to endure the void her daughter had left. Jack, Elizabeth's husband, had always been a complex figure in Helen's eyes. When Elizabeth first brought him home, Jack was charismatic, quick with a joke, and easy on the eyes. Yet beneath the charm, Helen sensed an undercurrent of selfishness. Over time, her instincts proved correct. Jack's love for Elizabeth was conditional, ebbing as soon as her health began to decline. Elizabeth's illness had tested everyone, but Jack's response was to retreat. While Helen dedicated herself to caring for her daughter, Jack buried himself in work and excuses, his presence growing increasingly rare. Elizabeth, ever the optimist, held on to hope that Jack would change. But Helen knew better. After Elizabeth's death, Jack's indifference turned into greed. He fixated on the apartment, determined to claim what he believed was his rightful inheritance. "Helen," he said during one of his uninvited visits, "this place is too much for you to handle. It's time to move on." Helen met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "This was Elizabeth's home. She wanted me here, and I'm not leaving." Jack's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You can't live in the past forever," he said smoothly. "Think of how much easier life would be if you let go." Helen remained unmoved, her resolve bolstered by a letter she had recently discovered. Tucked away in Elizabeth's journal was an envelope addressed to her mother. Inside, Elizabeth's words were a beacon of hope.
"Dearest Mom, I know Jack better than he thinks. If you're reading this, he's probably trying to take what doesn't belong to him. Don't let him. I've taken steps to ensure you're protected. Trust Mr. Alden. He'll know what to do. With love, Elizabeth."
With renewed determination, Helen contacted Mr. Alden, the family lawyer. He confirmed what Elizabeth had prepared, a solid legal foundation that made it nearly impossible for Jack to claim the apartment. But Helen knew Jack wouldn't give up easily. Jack's visits became more frequent and invasive. He prowled around the apartment as if it were already his eyes lingering on valuables and fixtures. "This place needs a lot of work," he'd mutter, more to himself than to Helen. One day, Helen's neighbor, Peter, knocked on her door. "Mrs. Thompson," he said with concern, "I saw Jack in the basement last night. He was messing with the electrical panel. Thought you should know." Helen's heart raced. She had suspected Jack would escalate, but now she had proof. She shared her fears with her neighbors, who immediately offered their support. Peter, an electrician, installed a hidden camera in the hallway, ensuring any of Jack's actions would be documented. As tension mounted, Jack's new girlfriend, Sophie, became a regular visitor. Unlike Elizabeth, Sophie shared Jack's opportunistic tendencies, but Helen noticed cracks in her facade. Sophie often lingered in the background, her eyes downcast and her expressions guarded. During one particularly tense visit, Sophie hesitated as they were leaving. "Be careful, Mrs. Thompson," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Helen's intuition told her Sophie might be a potential ally. There was a glimmer of hesitation in her actions, a sign that she wasn't as fully committed to Jack's schemes as she pretended to be. The apartment had become more than just a home. It was a battleground for dignity and justice. With her community's support and the lingering hope that Sophie might turn against Jack, Helen prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Jack's frustration festered with each failed attempt to coerce Helen into leaving. The legal barriers Elizabeth had put in place were solid, and Helen's unyielding stance only fueled his resentment. However, Jack was not a man easily deterred. His desperation for control over the apartment began to manifest in more sinister ways. One evening, Helen returned from a brief walk to find the locks on her apartment door had been changed. Jack, leaning casually against the hallway wall, greeted her with a smug grin. "Problem, Helen?" he asked, twirling a set of keys in his hand. "Why would you do this, Jack?" Helen's voice trembled, but her eyes remained sharp. "I'm simply protecting my investment," he replied coldly. "Maybe it's time you considered other living arrangements." Helen turned away, her mind racing. She knew Jack was pushing boundaries, hoping to provoke her into giving up. But she also knew the law was on her side. Without hesitation, she called Mr. Alden, who reassured her that Jack's actions were not only unethical but illegal. By the next morning, the locks were changed again, this time under Helen's supervision, with a stern warning sent to Jack through legal channels. The confrontation only deepened Jack's resolve. He started harassing Helen in subtler ways, shutting off the electricity during the night, leaving threatening notes under her door, and spreading rumors among the neighbors about her supposed instability. But Helen, with the support of her community, stood firm. One day, as Helen sorted through some of Elizabeth's old belongings, she found an envelope she hadn't seen before. Inside was a handwritten note from Elizabeth, filled with warm memories and a message of encouragement.
Mom, I know things might get tough, especially with Jack, but remember, you're stronger than you think. You always have been. This apartment is our home, and no one can take that from you. Trust yourself and trust the people who care about you. Love, Elizabeth.
The note reignited Helen's determination. She shared it with her close neighbor Peter, whose protective nature had been a source of comfort. "He's escalating," Peter warned after hearing about the latest incidents. "We need to catch him in the act." Together, they devised a plan. Peter installed a hidden camera outside Helen's apartment and another inside, ensuring any future attempts by Jack to sabotage her would be documented. The sense of solidarity among Helen's neighbors grew stronger, with more of them stepping forward to offer help. Meanwhile, Jack's new girlfriend, Sophie, began to see a different side of him. At first, she was drawn to his charm and confidence, but his obsession with the apartment and his increasingly erratic behavior made her uneasy. During one of their heated arguments, Jack revealed his true intentions. "I'm not going to let her sit there and rot in that apartment while I'm left with nothing," he growled. "Is this really about Elizabeth's legacy, or is it just about you?" Sophie shot back. "You're acting like a man who's lost everything, but you're the one throwing it all away." Jack dismissed her concerns, but Sophie's doubts grew. Her visits to the apartment became less frequent, and when she did accompany Jack, she lingered in the background, avoiding Helen's gaze. Helen noticed Sophie's hesitation and wondered if there might be a way to turn her against Jack. One night, Helen heard commotion outside her door. She peeked through the peephole to see Jack arguing with another tenant, who was accusing him of tampering with the building's security system. The argument escalated until the tenant threatened to call the police. "That's enough," Helen said, opening the door. Her voice carried an authority that silenced them both. "Jack, you've gone too far." Jack's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "This isn't over, Helen," he said, his tone menacing. "It is over," she replied firmly, "and I'll make sure everyone knows it." The incident marked a turning point. Helen's resolve was stronger than ever, and with the support of her neighbors and Mr. Alden, she began to build a case against Jack, ensuring that his every move would be scrutinized. As Jack's legal and psychological warfare intensified, Helen found herself entangled in a deeper network of support. The neighbors, once distant acquaintances, rallied around her, forming an unlikely alliance against Jack's schemes. Peter, ever resourceful, became a key figure in Helen's defense, coordinating efforts to expose Jack's underhanded tactics. One such ally was Lydia, an elderly woman who had lived in the building for over 30 years. Her sharp wit and knowledge of local regulations proved invaluable. "Jack's not just dealing with you," she said one afternoon, sipping tea in Helen's kitchen. "He's taking on all of us now." Lydia's words resonated. The apartment was no longer just a battleground between Helen and Jack. It symbolized the resilience of an entire community. Meanwhile, Sophie's internal conflict grew. Jack's relentless pursuit of the apartment revealed a side of him she hadn't anticipated. Late at night, she would replay their arguments in her mind, questioning her role in his plans. Her unease reached a tipping point when Jack began discussing more drastic measures. "We need to accelerate things," Jack muttered during one of their clandestine meetings. "If she won't leave willingly, we'll make her." "What does that mean?" Sophie asked, her voice barely masking her fear. Jack's eyes narrowed. "You don't need to know the details. Just trust me." But Sophie couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was complicit in something far worse than she'd imagined. At the same time, Helen's lawyer, Mr. Alden, uncovered a crucial piece of evidence. Jack had been secretly funneling money into a private account, presumably to finance his legal battles and other unsavory plans. This discovery gave Helen a significant advantage, but it also raised the stakes. "It's clear he's desperate," Mr. Alden warned during a meeting at Helen's apartment. "Desperation can make people dangerous." Helen nodded, her resolve unshaken. "Let him come. We'll be ready." The community's support system expanded further when a young journalist named Eric, who lived 2 floors above, caught wind of the situation. Intrigued by the neighborhood's united front against Jack, he approached Helen with an offer. "I'd like to document what's happening here," Eric said. "People need to see how greed and entitlement can tear families apart, but also how solidarity can prevail." Helen hesitated at first, wary of bringing more attention to an already tense situation. But after discussing it with Peter and Lydia, she agreed. "If it helps others going through something similar, then it's worth it," she said. Eric's articles began appearing in local newspapers, painting a vivid picture of Helen's struggle. Public sympathy grew, and with it, pressure on Jack to back down. Yet, Jack remained defiant, emboldened by his own hubris. One night, as Helen prepared for bed, there was a knock at her door. It was Sophie, her face pale and eyes filled with worry. "I need to talk to you," she said in a hushed tone. Helen invited her in, and Sophie wasted no time. "Jack's planning something," she confessed. "He won't tell me exactly what, but it's bad. I'm scared, Mrs. Thompson." Helen listened intently, her suspicions confirmed. "Thank you for coming to me," she said. "You did the right thing." With Sophie's information, Helen and Peter devised a new plan. They decided to confront Jack, not with threats, but with evidence. The hidden cameras had captured enough of his actions to build a solid case, and with Sophie's testimony, they had a chance to turn the tide completely. The next day, Helen, Peter, and Mr. Alden called a meeting with Jack in the apartment's communal hall. Jack arrived, confident as ever, but his demeanor shifted when he saw Sophie standing beside Helen. "What is this?" Jack demanded. Helen stepped forward. "It's over, Jack. We have proof of everything. Your harassment, your financial misconduct, and your threats. You're done." Jack's face darkened. "You think you can scare me with this little show?" Mr. Alden calmly placed a folder on the table. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Unless you want to face criminal charges, I suggest you reconsider your position." Sophie added, her voice steady despite her trembling hands, "I'll testify against you if I have to." For the first time, Jack looked genuinely unsettled. He realized the walls were closing in, and his usual bravado wouldn't save him. Jack's arrogance finally faltered as he sat across from Helen and her allies. The weight of the evidence against him was undeniable, but his pride wouldn't let him concede so easily. "You think this changes anything?" Jack sneered, leaning back in his chair. "You may have a few videos and a sob story, but I've been through worse. You're all bluffing." Mr. Alden remained calm, sliding another document across the table. "This isn't a bluff, Jack. We've already submitted a preliminary report to the authorities. Any further action on your part will only solidify the case against you." Sophie's betrayal was the final nail in the coffin. Jack glared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. "You," he growled. "I trusted you." "You trusted no one, Jack," Sophie shot back, her voice firm. "And now you'll face the consequences of your actions." Jack stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. This isn't over, he spat before storming out of the room. For Helen, the moment was bittersweet. The immediate threat seemed to have passed, but Jack's parting words left an uneasy feeling. That night, she couldn't shake the tension lingering in the air. Her neighbors reassured her, promising to stay vigilant. 2 days later, the true turning point arrived. Helen returned home from a grocery trip to find the building surrounded by police and fire trucks. Smoke billowed from the upper floors, and frantic neighbors stood on the sidewalk, watching in horror. Helen's heart sank. What happened? She asked Peter, who was among the crowd. There was a fire, he said grimly. It started near your apartment. Helen's knees nearly gave out, but Peter caught her. They've evacuated everyone, he continued. No one was hurt, but the damage is extensive. Helen knew immediately who was behind it. Jack, in a final act of desperation, had resorted to arson. What he didn't anticipate, however, was the extent of his failure. The hidden cameras, though damaged, had captured footage of Jack entering the building shortly before the fire started. Moreover, several neighbors had seen him lurking near the basement where the building's electrical panel was located. The police wasted no time. Jack was arrested the following day, charged with arson, attempted intimidation, and endangerment. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and Sophie's testimony further sealed his fate. In the courtroom, Jack's demeanor was markedly different from the confident man who had once tried to bully Helen. His lawyer's efforts were futile, and Jack was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As Jack was led away, he locked eyes with Helen. For a moment, there was no malice, only the hollow realization of a man who had lost everything. Helen, however, felt no triumph, only relief that the ordeal was finally over. The aftermath of the fire left a profound mark on the community, but Helen emerged from the ordeal with her resolve intact. Though her apartment bore the scars of Jack's final act, it remained standing, a testament to the resilience of its occupants and the strength of their unity. The neighbors quickly mobilized to help Helen. Peter led the charge, coordinating repairs with the building's management. We'll get this place back to normal in no time, he assured Helen as they cleared debris from the hallway. Lydia, ever resourceful, organized a donation drive, gathering furniture, clothes, and household essentials. Within days, Helen's apartment began to feel like home again, albeit with a few changes. The piano, miraculously untouched by the fire, stood proudly in the corner, its presence a comforting reminder of Elizabeth. Despite the overwhelming support, Helen felt the emotional toll creeping in. The nights were the hardest, quiet moments where the weight of her losses pressed heavily on her chest. But each morning, she woke with renewed determination, finding solace in the small victories. A repaired window, a freshly painted wall, the return of familiar sounds as the building came back to life. Mr. Alden continued to provide legal guidance, ensuring Jack's sentence would stand without appeal. You've been through a lot, Helen, he said during one of their meetings. But you've handled this with more grace than anyone could have expected. Helen nodded, her expression one of quiet gratitude. It's not just me, she replied. It's everyone who stood by me. Couldn't have done it alone. The local media, spurred by Eric's ongoing coverage, highlighted Helen's story as a symbol of community resilience. The articles drew attention to the broader issue of elder abuse and property disputes, sparking conversations about tenant rights and the importance of neighborhood solidarity. Eric's work also had a personal impact. He frequently visited Helen, not just as a journalist, but as a friend. Over cups of tea, they shared stories, and Helen found herself opening up about her life, her late husband, and her journey with Elizabeth. These conversations became a source of healing, allowing Helen to process her grief in a safe and supportive environment. As for Sophie, her absence was noticeable. After her testimony against Jack, she had retreated from the building, leaving many to wonder about her next steps. Helen couldn't help but think of the young woman and the burden she carried. One evening, as Helen sat by the piano, her fingers idly tracing its keys, she received a knock at the door. It was Peter, carrying a small box. Found this in the basement, he said, handing it to her. Inside were remnants of Helen's life that had survived the fire. Charred photos, a half-melted trinket, and a single letter, its edges singed but the words intact. It was another note from Elizabeth, written shortly before her passing.
Dear Mom, I've always admired your strength. No matter what life throws at you, you've faced it head-on. I know you'll do the same now. Keep living, keep fighting, and never lose hope. Love, Elizabeth.
Helen read the letter with tears streaming down her face. It was a reminder of her purpose, her resilience, and the love that had carried her through. She placed the letter in a frame, setting it on the mantel alongside Elizabeth's photo. The next morning, Helen took a deep breath as she stepped out of her apartment. The hallway, now restored, was filled with the sounds of life, neighbors chatting, children playing, and the faint hum of construction. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a home, a sanctuary where hope had been rekindled. The air in Helen's apartment was lighter now. Repairs were nearly complete. The community had returned to its usual rhythm. Yet, Helen knew her journey wasn't over. The emotional wounds, though less visible than the fire damage, required time to heal. She had just settled down with a book one evening when there was a hesitant knock at her door. Helen opened it to find Sophie standing there, her face pale and her hands nervously clutching a small purse. Her eyes, once filled with uncertainty, now carried a quiet determination. "Mrs. Thompson," Sophie began, her voice trembling, "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I need your help." Helen, though surprised, stepped aside and gestured for Sophie to come in. "You've been through a lot too," Helen said gently. "Sit down and tell me what's on your mind." Sophie hesitated before taking a seat at the kitchen table. She took a deep breath, her hands still fidgeting. "I'm pregnant," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Helen's eyes softened. "I see. And Jack?" Sophie shook her head. "He doesn't know, and he won't. I want this child to have a chance at a better life, free from his influence. But I don't know where to start. I've never had a real family. Jack's manipulation pulled me in, but I don't want to make the same mistakes." Helen listened intently, her heart aching for the young woman sitting before her. "You've already taken the first step by recognizing the cycle and wanting to break it," she said. "That takes courage, Sophie." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared, Mrs. Thompson. I don't know how to be a good mother. I don't want my child to grow up in the shadow of my past." Helen reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on Sophie's. "You're not alone. We all need help sometimes, and asking for it is a sign of strength, not weakness." Over the next few weeks, Helen and Sophie developed an unlikely but strong bond. Helen became a mentor, sharing wisdom and life lessons learned through her own hardships. She taught Sophie practical skills, from budgeting to preparing for motherhood, but more importantly, she offered her unwavering support. With Sophie settling into her new life, Helen felt a sense of closure slowly taking shape. The apartment, once a battleground, had become a sanctuary again. Yet life carried its own rhythm, and Helen knew the journey was never truly over. The community remained close-knit, but the scars of Jack's actions lingered in subtle ways. Helen often found herself reflecting on the past months, marveling at how adversity had brought them all together. The resilience of her neighbors and the bond she had formed with Sophie were testaments to the power of unity and second chances. One day, Helen received an unexpected letter from the city's housing authority. Curious, she opened it to find a notice of recognition for her efforts in bringing awareness to elder abuse and tenant rights. The letter invited her to speak at an upcoming community event, where she could share her story and inspire others facing similar struggles. Helen was initially hesitant. Public speaking wasn't her forte, and the thought of revisiting those painful memories in front of an audience felt daunting. But after discussing it with Sophie and Peter, she decided to accept. "It's a chance to turn all that pain into something positive," Peter encouraged. Sophie added, "Your story helped me. Imagine how many others you could reach." The days leading up to the event were filled with anticipation and preparation. Helen worked closely with Eric, who helped her craft a speech that was both powerful and heartfelt. Together, they sifted through photos and documents, piecing together a narrative that highlighted not just the challenges but the triumphs as well. On the day of the event, the community hall was packed. Helen stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edges nervously. She looked out at the crowd, spotting familiar faces, Peter, Lydia, Eric, and Sophie, who gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Helen began. She spoke of love and loss, of standing firm against greed and manipulation, and of the unexpected strength found in the support of others. Her voice wavered at times, but she pressed on, sharing not just her story but the lessons learned along the way. By the time she finished, the room was silent, a collective weight of emotion hanging in the air. Then, a wave of applause erupted, filling the hall with a warmth that brought tears to Helen's eyes. After the event, several attendees approached Helen to thank her for her courage and to share their own stories. Among them was a young woman who revealed she was in a similar situation, battling a landlord's unfair treatment. "You've given me hope," she said. "Thank you for showing me that I'm not alone." Helen smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. "We're stronger together," she replied. That night, as Helen returned to her apartment, she felt a profound sense of peace. The journey that had begun with grief and turmoil had brought her to a place of renewal and purpose. And in the quiet of her home, surrounded by the mementos of her past and the promise of a brighter future, she allowed herself to simply be. A few weeks after the community event, life had begun to settle into a comforting rhythm. Sophie was thriving, preparing for the arrival of her baby, while Helen continued to deepen her connection with her neighbors. The apartment had been fully restored, and it now felt like a beacon of hope and resilience. One evening, however, Helen experienced a sharp pain in her chest. Brushing it off as stress, she decided to rest. But when the pain persisted, Peter insisted on taking her to the hospital. There, the doctors diagnosed her with a heart condition, likely exacerbated by the stress of recent events. Though Helen tried to downplay her condition, her friends and neighbors refused to let her face it alone. Sophie especially took it upon herself to ensure Helen was cared for. "You've done so much for me," she said. "Now it's my turn." As the weeks passed, Helen's health fluctuated. Despite her declining strength, she remained determined to live fully. She often reminded Sophie of the importance of creating a safe and loving environment for her child. "Life is unpredictable," Helen would say, "but love and kindness are constants we can always choose." One afternoon, Sophie went into labor. Helen, despite her frailty, insisted on being by her side at the hospital. Holding Sophie's hand through the contractions, she whispered words of encouragement. The birth was a turning point for both women, a moment where the pain of the past was eclipsed by the promise of new life. Sophie gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him David, a tribute to Elizabeth's father and a nod to the strength and compassion that had been passed down through generations. Holding her son for the first time, Sophie looked at Helen with tears in her eyes. "I wouldn't be here without you," she said. As the weeks went by, Helen's health took a sharp decline. One evening, surrounded by Sophie, Peter, Lydia, and other neighbors, Helen peacefully passed away in her sleep. Though her loss was deeply felt, her passing became a moment of reflection for everyone she had touched. Helen's passing marked the end of an era, but her legacy lived on in the lives she had touched. In the days following her funeral, the community gathered to honor her memory. The small garden outside the apartment building was dedicated in her name, a place where neighbors could come together and reflect on the strength she had inspired. Sophie, now a mother, often visited the garden with baby David. Each visit was a reminder of Helen's unwavering support and the lessons she had imparted. Sophie was determined to raise her son with the values of kindness, resilience, and integrity that Helen had embodied. Peter and Lydia continued their roles as pillars of the community, ensuring that Helen's spirit of unity and compassion remained alive. They organized regular gatherings in the garden, where neighbors shared stories, laughter, and support. Eric, the journalist, compiled his coverage of Helen's journey into a series of articles that resonated with readers far beyond the neighborhood. One evening, as Sophie prepared dinner, she paused to look at a framed photo of Helen and Elizabeth on the mantel. "You'll always be a part of our lives," she whispered. David, now a curious toddler, toddled over to her, clutching a small toy. Sophie scooped him up, holding him close. "And you'll grow up knowing the incredible women who made all of this possible," she said, kissing his forehead. Helen's apartment, now filled with Sophie's laughter and David's playful giggles, had transformed into a home of warmth and love once more. It stood as a testament to the power of community and the enduring impact of a life lived with purpose. As the sun set on another day, Sophie sat by the window, watching the soft glow of the garden lights. She felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that Helen's legacy was secure, carried forward in the hearts of those she had loved. Sophie stood in the garden, cradling David as the early morning sun bathed the flowers in golden light. The dedication plaque for Helen glinted softly, a permanent reminder of the woman who had held this community together. "Look, David," she said, pointing to the plaque. "This is where it all began. One day, I'll tell you about Helen, about her strength, and how she helped us find our way." David cooed in her arms, his tiny fingers reaching for the light. Sophie smiled, feeling the weight of her promise. She was determined to break the cycle, to raise her son in a home filled with love, honesty, and the kind of resilience Helen had taught her. As she turned to leave, Sophie glanced back at the apartment. It was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of hope filled with memories and the promise of a better future. Helen's legacy would live on, not only in the walls of her home, but in every act of kindness, every lesson passed down, and every new beginning that sprang from the strength she had instilled in those around her. And with that, Sophie walked back inside, ready to face the day and the future that lay ahead. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change lives. Helen's story reminds us of the strength in unity, the importance of resilience, and the impact one person can have on an entire community. If you've ever been inspired by someone who stood by you in difficult times, share this story and spread the message of hope and compassion. Let's keep the cycle of kindness alive, because together, we are stronger. What lessons did you take from Helen's journey? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.